I would like to respectfully acknowledge that tonight's event comes to you from unceded sovereign land. I'm joining you from the lands of the Gundungurra and Dharawal people. I pay respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders of all communities this conversation reaches. My name is Julia Zamiro, and I'll be your host for this evening. Tonight, we pay tribute to the life and legacy of the wonderful artist, Mirka Mora. This event, My Mirka, is presented in partnership by the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas and the Jewish Museum of Australia, which illuminates Jewish life at the intersection of art and Jewish culture, creating a place for all people to share in the Australian Jewish experience. Now, as soon as the Jewish Museum's exhibition Mirka opened, staff were flooded with personal stories from visitors to the exhibition whose lives were touched by Mirka Mora. Some were close friends, others had a fleeting encounter with her walking down the street, and some watching her sumptuously eat a chocolate eclair through a cafe window. You'll hear more about that later on. In response, the museum put out a call for the public to share their stories, memories and anecdotes of Mirka Mora. Now I'm pleased to introduce Eleni Papavasileiou, Senior Curator and Collection Manager from the Jewish Museum of Australia, to tell us a little bit more about the My Mirka project.
Our exhibition on the wonderful and prolific Mirka Mora at the Jewish Museum of Australia has been so warmly embraced by the public. Despite the interruption and our museum closure due to the pandemic, audience engagement and response to Mirka has been so strong on site and online. So many people that visited us or engaged with us via our social media had so many stories, and they were warm and funny, moving and surprising, but above all, painted an even greater picture of Mirka as one that truly touched people and made an impression and inspired. And how could she not? Resilient and highly optimistic, a hard-working artist, always thirsty for knowledge. Love was all around her. And all of us involved in the exhibition fell in love with her. Her story, so compelling, and her art, so poignant. I spent many hours reading and researching, listening to her interviews and studying the breadth of her work, archival material, and collected treasures. Being in the magical ambiance of her studio space, exploring and discovering, and relishing in the tactility and diversity of her work will stay with me forever. Memories were important to Mirka, as they are for museums, and our own vision to illuminate Jewish lives. The generosity of all lenders and contributors, and especially that of William Mora and Anna Mortley, has meant that we could share so much of her life and work, inspire, educate, delight, and trigger people's memories of Mirka's presence in this city and their lives. I hope you enjoy all the memories you're about to hear of how Mirka impacted so many people in her communities, near and far.
I had the deep honour of being able to be the Master of Ceremonies for the State Memorial service that we held for Mirka back in September 2018. It was held at the Palais Theatre in St Kilda, which is so apt because it's not far from the Talano restaurant. But as I said at the service, you can always hear from those Palais Theatre dressing rooms the squeals of delighted children as they're going up and down the rides of Luna Park, which is just nearby. And I think that's very apt to hear the sounds of children associated with that theatre and certainly with Mirka on that day when we said goodbye. Two performers on that day, Bernadette Robinson and Kate Sobrano, sang beautiful songs. Bernadette sang Non, je ne regrette rien by Edith Piaf, and Kate sang I Say a Little Prayer. It was an inspired choice to be there on that day in that theatre. And now, without further ado, Let's hear from this evening's storytellers.
You can't sum up my mother in a couple of minutes. It's impossible. But the two things I think are important. One is the role of my father, George Mora, and how he encouraged her. He was a feminist. He encouraged my mother's art, and he was a great connoisseur and very educated in art. And he was a big factor in pushing her forward. And as I say, he believed in women's rights. So it was a wonderful marriage of minds, actually. The other thing that I think about regarding my mother is how underestimated she has been as an artist. That's because Australia was very misogynist when they arrived in Australia, and probably still is. But it was very misogynist, and Mirka was kind of a natural feminist. She was just naturally provocative and very, very funny. And if she saw snobs or misogynists or what, reactionaries, her answer was to show her bum, which shocked everyone and was totally in the spirit of Dada and surrealism and all those art movements of which Mirka was very aware. That's the last thing I'd like to emphasize. Mirka was a very literate and culturally literate in art history. And this has been not emphasized enough because of her hijinks and because she smushed chocolate cake on James Coburn's face on her birthday, all her funny stuff, which made her very endearing and got her a lot of attention. But it's kind of irrelevant because she was actually a scholar of great art. So I miss her terribly.
So I first met Mirka when I was 14, actually. My mum had taken me to a soft sculpture workshop, and then as an adult I'd often see her just roaming around the streets of Richmond or in the supermarket. She lives not far from Bloom's head office, and we'd say hi and chat, as she did to most people on her outings. But our friendship really began in 2004. Our son Justin had died of SIDS, and in those early days I became consumed by documenting his memory with photos and videos, and I also became quite obsessed with everything being tidy and straight and neat. And I was tidying up a bookshelf and I saw one of my many Mirka books on the shelf, and it gave me the idea for Mirka to paint angels of Justin for our girls as a way for them to feel his presence in a more whimsical, sort of magical way. So I called William and sort of planted the seed, and he called me back and said, Mirka would love to, here's her number, give her a call. So I gave her a call and she said, of course I will, I'd love to, on one condition, that you paint them with me. So that was really the beginning of hours and hours together. So we painted those angels and we talked and cried and laughed, and she told me so many stories of her life. And it was just a very comforting time for me. Sort of while everyone else was sort of walking around on eggshells and whispering, she would do things like scream Justin's name out in her big, bold French accent, and that was a great comfort for me. I'd go there sometimes with Amber and I'd be breastfeeding Amber, and I came back one time and she said, oh, I did this picture of you breastfeeding Amber with, there's a bird overlooking Amber and it's Justin coming to visit. And again, she wasn't specific, but she said potentially future children. So that was just a really lovely gift that she gave me. And she used to call my husband Brian Chateaubriand. So it says to Natalie and Chateaubriand. Love Mirka. So that's it is a really lovely memory, and we had that hanging in our bedroom. So Mirka and I didn't really paint much together after the Angels, but we continued to just spend so much time together. She taught me how to embroider and crochet and things like that. She taught me a lot about colour and, as you know, Mirka was so well read, so we'd talk a lot about books and food and but one thing, her haven of love and clutter, which is, the perfect name for her book, really, her home just has so much soul, and I've always collected references and inspiration and had that around me in my workspace. But I guess what has influenced me a lot is bringing that into my home space. So normally I am quite ordered and clean and there's parts of Mirka that I feel within my own living spaces today, all my bits and pieces, and I've collected so much reference material for my work and things that inspire me. But there's bits and pieces that I was lucky enough to get from the Lena Joel auction that have so much meaning for me and my time with Mirka. Some paintbrushes and books and things like that I really do cherish. There's an odd little copper spoon thing up there, and I often just get a glimpse of things and feel transported to her beautiful world and my memories of her. We've got a plaque on a chair in the Botanic Gardens for Justin, and Mirka was kind enough to do a beautiful little drawing of an angel that we etched onto the plaque. So I've got the original artwork, which I love to walk past, and a little drawing she did for me one day. We had lunch at Francois. So yeah, I feel really connected to her in this room in particular.
I was at a school friend's birthday party, so I would have been about 7 or 8, and we were outside playing one of the pass the parcel games or something like that, and she lived in Aspendale near the beach. And we were playing this game, and the game had wound up, and there was a family coming back from the beach, and they were all laughing, and they had all their beach gear, and I was just transfixed watching them. And this lovely lady who had this beautiful aura about her, and I couldn't stop staring. And the mother of the child whose party it was calling everybody inside and ushering them all in. I wouldn't move, and I was just watching them, and I thought, I want to go to them. And it was like the Pied Piper, and I wanted to just follow along and be with this group. And I didn't really think about it until years later when I was reading Mirka's book, and she was describing, and I think they had a beach cart, and when I read it I thought, that's the family. And I contacted the girl whose birthday party it was and said to her, did Mirka Mora live in your street? And she said, yeah. She said, Mum would just spin out because Mirka would sunbake nude and all that sort of thing at a suburban beach, Bayside Beach. So, and that was my first meeting, which I hadn't thought about until years later reading Wicked But Virtuous. So I'd always loved her art, and there was a mini exhibition at Merrick's General Store on the Mornington Peninsula. So a group of us women were going to go. So we were like big groupies, and we picked up a friend who lived in Geelong. We picked her up from the ferry and drove across, and we were all excited in the car, and there was lots of chatter, and I was the designated driver, and I was a bit disappointed because I thought, well, I won't be able to drink and I'm going to miss all the fun. But we got there, and I needn't have worried because it was like a festival. It was, so there was food and people were drinking, but, not to excess. The atmosphere was just amazing, and there was a section at the Merrick's General Store, a couple of rooms, and they had Mirka's paintings in there. And one of my friends, she was in there having a quiet moment looking at one of the paintings, and she was crying, and someone came in and said, what are you crying about, Jo? And she said, just crying at the beauty of it. And they were sort of like puzzled, but I got what she meant because the beauty of these paintings was amazing. So we were in there having food and drink, and Mirka was talking, did some questions and answers, and there was chatting, but we were dancing, and Mirka was just so beautiful, her energy. She was down our tops and saying, oh, you've got nice buzzies, and she was lifting up her skirts, and it was wild. And at one stage, the ex-Premier of Victoria, Ted Ballieu. He was climbing over tables to get to Mirka, and we've got photos of it. And it was like Midsummer Night's Dream. He was like Puck on the table, and it was like, what, you know, this straighty 180 dude's on the table. And so she brought out the childlike, you know, nature in everybody. So she brought that out of everyone. It was sort of like this freedom to express yourself and let go of your inhibitions, because she was so free and irreverent. And so there was this, you know, atmosphere of like a festival and this Mirka energy. And for some reason, in one of the rooms at the Merrick's General Store, there was a bed. I don't know if it was in there for storage, or I don't really know what it was doing in there. But at one stage, a group of us ended up on the bed in this Mirka puddle, you know, frolicking with Mirka on the bed, you know, during the day in the gentrified part of the Mornington Peninsula. And it was quite wild this day. And I contacted a friend, because once it had come up about looking at stories about Mirka Mora, I was looking for the photos of Ted Ballieu climbing on the table. And I messaged a friend and said, have you got that photo? And she said, I haven't got the photo. And she said, but do you know what? I will never, ever forget the feeling of that day. And all my friends that I speak to are the same. And when we left, this group of middle-aged women were squealing and laughing in the car. And I tell you, if Mirka had been selling T-shirts, this group of women would have been like teenage girls gone to a concert. We would have been wearing Mirka Tour 2013. It was so exciting. She should have been selling show bags. It was great. I loved it. So I never forget that day. And of all the things we've experienced in our lives, and we've, you know, had weddings and children and, you know, all these beautiful times, that day is one of the best days of my life. Oh, so I do love her art, but I think it was Mirka herself and her energy that inspired me the most. So when I was, you know, in my 40s and, you know, growing up throughout my life, I felt a bit different, and I felt like I was sort of, you know, didn't fit in and whatever. And then meeting Mirka and everybody loving her exactly how she was, that she didn't modify herself, or, you know, there was no watered down cordial of Mirka. It was full strength Mirka, and that's what you got, and people loved that. So she sort of inspired me to just be authentically myself, and also to create. So when the first lockdown hit and everybody was posting that they'd done 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles, sort of a thought in my mind, like, what would Mirka do? And I thought, I'm going to mosaic a bus. So I did. I mosaiced a bus in mirror glass, and every day, day after day, sticking on these tiles, I just kept thinking about Mirka and, you know, that she was always compelled to create. And that's how I felt. Like in the mornings, I'd get up and I think, I just want to make something. I just want to make something. I want to create something. And even if people hated it, just to think, you know, to make them think and go, what's the go there? And show myself and who I was. And I just carry her energy with me, which is really weird because I'm not related to her, but I just feel like she's one of the greatest female influences of my life. So I feel very lucky.
So my Mirka memory is from my childhood. I grew up in Vermont, and our local doctor, Tom Smythe, actually commissioned, I have discovered, Mirka to make a mural for the waiting room in his doctor's surgery. So I grew up with this incredibly large painting in my local doctor's surgery. I understand it was called the Vermont Beastery from doing a little bit of research, and I now know that the painting has been donated to the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre collection in Melbourne. So it has a life in a medical world still, and I hope it's still giving people joy. So the painting was this really probably about 2.5 metres wide by maybe about 1 metre tall. So it was a really large painting. And like lots of Mirka's paintings, it was really painterly. And there was a border of kind of little plants and kind of decorative elements. And then there was a grid in the middle of all these different kind of beasts. The middle kind of section was a snake with all these kind of love hearts on it. There was like dragons and scorpions in it. But my memory is kind of waiting in the doctor's waiting room to go and see the doctor. And my mum would distract us because she would say things like, oh, you know, how many wings can you see? How many eyes can you count in the painting? And all those kind of things to kind of distract us while we were waiting there, obviously being a little bit annoying when we were waiting for the doctor to see us. And I just remember once that my little brother was there, and Mick sort of in the middle of it piped up and said, hey, Mum, why's that dinosaur? Why's it got big boobs? At that perfect moment where everyone was very quiet in the waiting room. And I just remember looking up and seeing all these people kind of trying not to burst out laughing, as my mum, I think, very validly tried to say, which one is the dinosaur, huh? I'm not sure which one it is. So my memory is really this kind of moment of fun and joy, but I think I probably spent a lot of time looking at that painting as a kid and wondering what was going on in it. So it was a painting that I spent a lot of time looking at because I spent a lot of time, you know, when you're young, going to the doctors for, you know, a variety of ailments. Well, I guess it probably has some influence because now I am a gallery director of a contemporary art gallery, but I think the joy of looking at art is what I remember about it. And even when I've gone to find where it was when we started this conversation, it still gives me joy to look at that painting. I have such happy memories of that painting. And I think that's one of the things that Mirka gave the world, these kind of colourful, creative paintings where you didn't really have all the answers because it didn't really all make sense sometimes. And I think that sparked my curiosity in the world of art and artists.
Growing up with Mirka as a grandmother was just as incredible and magic as you would imagine, really. But of course, she was nothing like most people's grannies. And I think the thing I remember the most was that she really encouraged as much bad behaviour as possible, and she really taught us how to be as naughty as we could. And we used to love doing things like going to restaurants with Mirka. And I have so many memories of being underneath the table while all the adults are eating, and she'd get down under the table with us. And she would kind of carefully untie everybody's shoelaces, and then we'd sort of maneuver their feet together so we could tie up people's shoes together, and then we'd be rolling around in hysterics when people realised that their feet were tied up together. And then she'd also showed us how to do things like take the salt shaker off the table and loosen it just the right amount so that when people go to salt their food, it just spills everywhere and ruins their meal. We used to find doing that sort of stuff hilarious. And she'd always order dessert first and tell us that we could do the same. So it was always great fun going out to eat in restaurants with Mirka. So Mirka was incredibly wicked, which I think has been very well documented. And I remember one of my birthdays as a child was probably my 6th or 7th birthday. And my parents decided to get Mirka to come and do face painting for all the kids, which sounds like a great idea in theory. But of course, Mirka's never one to take direction or instructions. And so she had a kind of line of 6, 7-year-old girls all asking to be princesses and fairies. And she decided instead to paint them all as devils and gargoyles. And I can just remember each child kind of looking in the mirror, screaming and bursting into tears. And so the whole party ended up with just 20 sobbing children and Mirka just standing in the middle, just howling with laughter. She thought it was hilarious. But I think she was so unpredictable and you kind of never knew what she was going to do or say, which was one of the reasons why she was so much fun to be around as a child. And she would in fact often tell you things that you knew she probably shouldn't be saying to a child that was probably not very age appropriate. So I have quite a few memories of things she told me that I just wish I could ask more about now. So things like there was a story where she said she was in the back of a cab and she fainted because someone showed her a very little dickie. And I just wish I could ask her now what that was about. So Mirka was extremely generous to everybody that she met, really, but especially her grandchildren. She spoiled us to probably quite a sickening degree, I would say. I remember one time she took my brother to a giant toy store, and she gave us a supermarket trolley each and said, you can have as many toys as you can fit in these trolleys. So I can just remember, I think my brother could only kind of just reach the handles of the trolley, and we were just running down the aisles of the toy store, just in sort of panicked delight, throwing toys into the trolley. And that was just for no special occasion. It was just an extremely generous act, and it was a great fun that day. And she also used to, I mean, every time we visited her, she'd allocated to each, to my brother and I, our own special drawer. And every time we went to visit her, there'd be different presents waiting for us in our drawer. So sometimes it would be kind of trinkets or chocolates, but then other times you might find like a Chanel lipstick in there. And actually recently I was just rereading some of her autobiography and discovered that Mirka had written that her mother actually used to leave little treats for her in a specific drawer. So that was quite a nice discovery, that she was obviously honouring that from her own mother. I'd love to carry on the tradition of the present drawer. Hopefully that's something I could do for my grandkids one day too. I think undoubtedly Mirka's early experiences of escaping the war shaped who she was. I think probably the cheekiness and naughtiness was always there, but I think her refusal to take life too seriously and her ability to find joy and happiness and silliness in almost any occasion. I do think that came from a deep understanding that she was incredibly lucky to be alive, and I think she really felt that her existence was a miracle, and she was just always going to make sure she lived a brilliant life, and she did.
Well, the family's relationship with Mirka goes back a long way, probably to the late 60s, because Mary, my wife, her mother, Rosa Lewis, who's the most formidable woman in Christendom, in my view, was running the Monarch Cake Shop, which was an institution, and then a delicatessen in Toorak Road, South Yarra. Mirka was a frequent client, and over a period of time they became great friends because they both had mutual respect for each other's ability. And one day, Mirka came into the shop and gave Rosa this small watercolour, which is really nice in itself. But I think the most interesting thing is what's on the back of it. Because what she had written was from one artiste to another, from the pretty young man and Mirka. Now, the pretty young man was a fellow, or is a fellow, Ross Lansall, with whom Mirka had a long-standing relationship. It was obviously in existence in the 1970s and was continuing from the time that I met her in the 1980s. And it seemed to me to be a fairly committed relationship between the two of them. So for the back of it, you'll see it's written from one artiste to another, from the pretty young man and Mirka, 71. I've got a very forceful daughter who's really her grandmother incarnate. And one night Mirka was at our place for dinner, and she decided to do some drawings for Emily. So she was sitting on the carpet and drawing angels and people. Emily was, I think, 3 at the time, took the pencil out of her hand and said, "No, Mirka, you don't draw angels and people like that. You do it like this." And then proceeded to scribble all over Mirka's angels and little drawings of people. And I thought to myself, this is the end of a perfect relationship. But Mirka thought it was terrific. And I remember thinking at the time, how many artists, whether it would be, Sidney Nolan, Picasso, Piero della Francesca, who would react in the same modest way. So Mirka really had a way of communicating with children and with people, which was one of her essential charms. The relationship continued, and Mirka became the godmother to my son Tom, and at that time she then presented both kids with a small oil painting just as a remembrance of that event. Her generosity was astounding. Like on another occasion, I was down at her place and I saw a particular oil painting which I really liked. And I said nothing. I told her I liked it. I said nothing more than that. Then a couple of months later, she came to our place for dinner and she presented me with this painting. This was the oil that I was admiring. And I said, look, I can't accept that. And she said, it is a gift. You must accept a gift. You liked it. I want you to have it. And you will have it. So that's another example of the type of person that she was. It wasn't a matter of commerce, it was a matter of relationships. And that's something that I both admired and respected in the woman. Also, I was down at her place one day with Emily when she was, oh look, I'm not too sure of the age, but she'd be 3 or 4. And Mirka took out a camera and photographed it as it was just a snap. I think it was on a Polaroid camera, but I'm not sure. But the interesting thing was that if you look at the photograph, it's really not a photograph of my daughter. It's a photograph of my daughter as seen through the eyes of Mirka, the artist. A few months later, she came down to my place, or our place, and gave me the photograph and the small painting of that photograph. So I had them framed, and they now happily reside in the bedroom of my daughter's home. Look, you can't put a price on friendship and you can't put a price on generosity. She wanted nothing from me but friendship. And I had nothing more to give her than friendship. So it was a very good mutual arrangement. Yes, we continued our friendship, and I'd drop in and she'd come for dinner. And I can remember one Sunday morning I went to her place and I said, come, let's go out for a cup of coffee and for a walk. We'll go along the jetty in St Kilda. And she said, no, Peter, I cannot come. I am an artist. I have to be disciplined. I have to draw 2 hours a day. And I said, all right, I'll come back, another time. Don't worry about it. And she said, Peter, you only live once. He said, we must seize the moment. And at that stage, she stuck her arm through mine and we disappeared off. And I remember thinking, thank God that I'm not in my 20s and she's in her 20s, because I could not stay the distance. I would have been exhausted. She's just a very interesting, sensual woman to the end of her days. And on another occasion, I went to see her in hospital because she had cancer. I'm not too sure whether the cervix or the uterus. I'm not too good on those points. And she said to me, look, I did not let my surgeon operate on me until he would draw my parts. And he said he wasn't an artist. I said, everybody is an artist. And she showed me the drawing, which was fairly, graphic. I was a bit taken aback by it. And she said to me, Peter, my husband, he died of cancer of the lungs, and I'd have cancer of the cunt. And I was absolutely surprised by this comment. The nurse disappeared. She looked at me and smiled.
As a very young and rather oppressed, sheltered young woman in the very late 70s, I often had tea at the Old George's department store in the city in its Regency room. It was actually the only thing I could afford there, to be honest. I adored its quiet, faded glamour, the fantasy it evoked for me, and the brief escapism it offered from my very confined, oppressively religious, regular world. It was time out from a rather grey and dutifully lived young life, following the protocols of others and very rarely my own. One day I noticed Mirka Mora sitting at the very far end of the Regency room to me, enjoying tea and a huge eclair. We're talking huge. I knew who she was immediately, as I was very familiar with her art, and it had always captivated, charmed and delighted me when I first encountered her work. Her angels and mythical creatures were hauntingly beautiful, transporting, joyful, yet imbued with another worldly sadness also. I always thought the eyes of her creatures were all-knowing somehow. That day at George's, no one knew who she was, I'm sure, apart from me. And Mirka sat at the very far end of the tea room, so no one was facing her. I kept my eye very quietly on her, trying not to stare. Suddenly, with absolute abandon, she just spontaneously and with true unbridled pleasure, something I was not that familiar with, she didn't just take delicate bites out of her eclair, but crammed the whole cake into her mouth, pushing with both hands either side of it until there was cream and chocolate icing all around her mouth, nose, and her face too. She didn't just eat it, she truly experienced it and delighted in all of it so sensually. Her face was glowing and radiant. I remember that so clearly, like a small child, and her eyes were sparkling and so alive. I was mesmerised, stunned, and quite shocked even, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. I enjoyed that eclair with her too, the freedom of it and the absolute liberation of pleasure. I knew then intrinsically, watching her, really deep enjoyment, oblivious to any possible judgment by anyone nearby, that we can take our pleasures without wearing society's silent censure. We can own our own joys without others' rules stopping us, and be free to be truly ourselves, no matter who was watching us or if no one was watching us. It was a wonderful and liberating lesson for me that she knew absolutely nothing about. Thanks, Mirka. It has stayed with me and will stay with me forever, and has impacted on my life in big and small ways ever since. Now, roughly 40 years after that wondrous eclair devouring, I feel Mirka is still an inspiration to myself as a much older woman now, and indeed to many other older women. Mirka was still creating, connecting, painting and living life on her own terms. We all need older, unconventional role models that have been true to themselves, their passions and beliefs till the end. This is what I think of as my Mirka moon mirror. It's in my lounge room now. It normally hangs in my hallway. So anyone who enters the house and exits the house passes my Mirka moon mirror. It's been hanging in my hall for so many years now, and it's got a little Mirka angel at the bottom of it, and I just photocopied it from a book, and I don't think Mirka would mind. It's quite crumpled because it's fallen off several times and I've stuck it back with blue tack. But it just makes me feel calm and settled and safe. It's a magical little guardian angel, caring angel, loving angel. And even though it's a bit battered now, it still is really special to me.
Well, I feel I was quite lucky to acquire the two typewriters from Mirka's estate. I originally saw them pop up on I was keeping an eye on the auction sites, and I saw them pop up in amongst the items that were being auctioned from her estate, and put a watch on it immediately. I'm a typewriter collector, and I have quite a collection of early 20th century typewriters, which I feel are pieces of industrial art, so that really kind of appealed to me. And particularly as it was Mirka's. I mean, I've come across Mirka a few times personally. Didn't have a close relationship with her, but she used to come by the Vic Market, where myself and a colleague used to run a umbrella stall, and she bought a few umbrellas off us over the years. And that's when I got to know her, you know, when I had the opportunity to talk to her a few times. Prior to that, as I'd worked in the Melbourne theatre industry for quite some time, Mirka used to appear at a lot of the plays that I used to work on, and she was clearly quite a supporter of the arts throughout Melbourne. And she was actually at the very first production that I worked at while I was still studying. And I remember her from that. I never got to speak to her then. It wasn't until much later when I was working in the umbrella store that I ever got to speak to her. But she certainly left a very nice impression on me for the years. And yeah, as I said, I felt quite fortunate to be able to acquire these two typewriters from her estate. And one of those letters, which is a personal one from a friend of hers that she'd given some advice to, was hidden inside one of these typewriters. And that really kind of captured it for me. It wasn't her handwriting, but it was a little piece of her life, a little bit of her story. A friend had obviously come in seeking some advice, and Mirka sat down with a cuppa and talked her through it, and you know, seemed to have cheered her up. And it was just really nice to find that tucked away in that typewriter. My dear Mirka, I spent all of my adult life looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And suddenly, on Tuesday, it appeared in the form of 8 little pots of gold you so kindly sent me. This is from a lady named Barbara. And Neville. It goes on to talk about sitting down and having a cup of coffee and the advice that she gave her, and how it was nice to have the company. And yes, I'd forgotten totally about the fact that she had actually sent her what looks like a couple of I don't know, baked goods, I assume. Doesn't really reference it. Well, the other typewriter was a bit of a shock. I spotted it when I went to pick it up from the auction house, but there was a hair tied around the space bar. I didn't realise tied around the time. I thought it was just caught on it. And I thought to myself, did somebody from the auction did her hair get cast off from the somebody at the auction? But when I got the typewriter home, I found that the hair had been tied around the space bar. Actually, there's a knot where somebody has carefully knotted onto it. And when I looked back at the auction's listing, I saw that the the hair was present. You could see it in the listing. Not that anybody made any sort of noise about it, but I was a little bit surprised to see it there. And being that Mirka had come by my stall at Vic Market a few times, I was pretty certain, seeing that it had that grey wave of colour that I was very familiar with from her, that it is one of her hairs tied around the spacebar. Very deliberately placed there, and I was a little bit, I was very happy to see that there, to be honest. It was literally a little piece of Mirka had come home with me. In a lot of ways, I don't like the idea of using these. They're old, they're dirty, but the old ribbons there probably have some of what was written once, and to get them working, I have to clean them up and remove a lot of those things that probably do have a lot of that history embedded in them. And for example, the hair that's tied around the spacebar, I just don't want to move those things to have a working typewriter. I can go and pick another one out of my collection if I wanted to write something on them. They're beautiful typewriters. These old 1920s ones aren't all that great to write on though.
Hi. I first met Mirka when I was 15 years old, when I started my apprenticeship at Tolano's French Bistro. My father was working there at the time as one of the head chefs, and Mirka and George's were running the gallery out the back. To say she had a flamboyant personality would be a real tragic understatement. She was full of energy and full of life. She certainly lit up a room every time she walked into it.
My first interaction with Mirka was about 15 when Dad released his first book, but the real time I spent with her was 18 over the summer when we restored all the murals at Tolano's. And it was an incredible time. I learnt a lot from her. I learnt a lot about the history of the place. But I think one of the most important things I learnt from her, apart from enjoying her amazing personality and her zeal for her work and life, was that if you really love what you do, you have to practice it every day. And it's a lesson that she taught me, and I carry it with me every day.
Mirka was a passionate woman, passionate about her work, but also passionate about her friends. And she had many friends. She would befriend just anybody would become her friend. She had open, wide arms with a big hug. But when something wasn't quite right, she wasn't worried about telling you either. She told you in no uncertain terms. You knew where you stood with Mirka and her great personality.
That's very true. I think one of the amazing things is when you sort of walk the streets with Mirka, whether it's St Kilda or the city, or even Richmond, when you're sort of walking around with her to get supplies or simply have some champagne and oysters, which was always on the menu somewhere. Just the love for her. From the people and the way she accepted those people and always gave those people coming up to her a lot of time, whether she knew them greatly or she was just meeting them for the first time. A lovely lady.
Mirka's legacy that she leaves with us, apart from the memories we have of her and her wonderful personality and her zeal for life, is her artwork. It is of great value, priceless artwork. So when I asked her to illustrate my cookbook, My Italian Heart, I was so honoured that she accepted and rose to the challenge and really added such depth to my book and my work. And it was just such a pleasure to do that collaboration with Mirka.
Yeah, I think one of the things about Mirka's art is that it really does capture your imagination and lets it run wild. One of the things I loved about Mirka was she had almost like a childlike innocence tempered with a very flamboyant love for everything in life. And I think that her art captures that beautifully. When you look at it, you can't help but whisk away to her imagination.
Mirka could always make me blush. When I first met her at 15, when I was 40, and when I was in my 50s. She was an incredible lady that knew how to make you feel good, but also keep you on the edge. Mirka will never be forgotten in this city. She is the fabric on what this city was built on. Personalities like her, creative spirit like her, are the thing that holds us all together and keeps us fresh.
What more can you say? She was the leader of the Bohemian movement. She gave Melbourne a certain part of culture and a certain life and effervescence, and that's something that we all have to keep alive today.
We'll always love you, Mirka.